Okay, so you're not going to believe this, but I heard a rumor that something happened in Russia a couple of days ago. Am I the only one who's heard about this? Well, pre-stream coffee, always. Always stream coffee is important. Hey, so I was hoping to get some really good stream guests to talk about the situation because I have two friends who, unlike I'm barely informed. I have two friends who are extremely well informed about these kinds of things. One of them is a Russian journalist who works for Deutsche Welle as usually like the on-air Russia analyst for Deutsche Welle, and the other one is a journalist who's currently based in Iraq and recently wrote about the current situation, like the current state of ISIS. Um, but unfortunately, the one who is it about them speaking Russian? I don't know. Unfortunately, the Russian journalist at Deutsche Welle is working tonight, so she's busy. She can't come on. And the friend who's also a journalist who's in Iraq is currently camping on the border in the mountains on the border with Iran. So she can't hop on stream from there either. Hopefully, we'll have one of them, if not both of them, next weekend, and we can have their definitely more informed takes on the situation than what I'm going to be able to provide tonight. So we're gonna do kind of an overview tonight, and we'll go way more in depth that next week. Yeah, I have extremely badass friends. How is everyone tonight? A quick check of the live stream. I say Marco, you say Polo. Marco? That's a very slow reaction time. Okay, let me try again. Marco? Okay, now I'm getting all the messages at the same time. Okay, that's pretty long. Okay, it's not too bad. It should be fine. So I missed a lot of things, didn't I? There's the attack in Moscow. There was the election in, if we can call it that, in Russia. There is a bunch of other things, especially because I didn't stream last weekend. I don't know how many of them we can cover, but let's do as many as we can. Oh, and I think if anyone wants to try this, I think I fixed the problem with the alerts that we had last time. The UN resolution, yes, we need to look at the UN resolution because it's interesting that when any other country puts forward a resolution calling for a ceasefire, the US vetoes it, and when the US puts forward a resolution, China and Russia are the ones to veto that. So let's try to figure out why. I haven't looked at it before, so we can look at it together on stream. Um, what was I saying? So yeah, I think I fixed the alerts problem. So now the only problem that I have with the alerts is if someone basically I had to do two separate systems for Twitch alerts and YouTube alerts. So let me show you. Let me do a quick demonstration. It's one moment. So if someone subscribes in theory, I don't know if this actually works, but someone subscribes or follows on YouTube, this is the alert. And if Same thing happens on Twitch. Wait a second. Okay, there's a weird glitch happening. It doesn't matter. Basically... Oh, wow. Grey Nightingale is now following. Yes, that is new. I guess you unsubscribed and resubscribed. But basically, if something happens on YouTube and Twitch at the same time, those two are going to kind of superimpose, unfortunately. If multiple things happen on YouTube, like a super chat and a follow and a whatever, they'll be one after the other. But I haven't figured out how to make it so that both YouTube and Twitch don't do that. But anyway, so yeah, that's the bit of technical news that hopefully is better than before. And let's look at this. Okay, that's the presidential election. I wanted to look at this attack. So, Moscow. We look at this video. I think it should be fine, hopefully. Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. There's an anecdote, not about this election, but just to illustrate how elections happen in Russia, that we'll get into when we cover that. Okay, 2 hours ago, what we know about the attack on a Moscow. Just look at. So I think now the death toll at the last time I checked a couple of hours ago, the death toll was 133. It's probably going to continue to go up from there. We are not going to be looking at footage from the attack. We are definitely not going to be looking at that on stream. That is for sure. Yeah, no, I was wondering if we could watch an Al Jazeera video. My question was more for copyright reasons, but apparently, yes. So I'm gonna assume that most people have heard about this, have probably more are not starting from scratch on this, but essentially, there was an attack on Friday evening at a concert hall at the Crocus City Hall in Moscow, and they used rifles. They killed 133 people. They used incendiary grenades, and they basically burned the entire building down. So, just out of curiosity to kind of gauge the audience here, what were your initial thoughts? I'm not saying did you oh, I was sure it was the CIA or I was sure it was this, but like what are the different possibilities that before we go into the fact that ISIS claimed it, let's go over like what the different options would be, assuming that this was breaking news at the moment. What do you mean there's no clarification? The building definitely burned down during the attack. So what do you mean by there isn't confirmation that the attackers burned it? Yeah, okay, so there's a few options there. So the big headline news involving Russia at the moment, obviously, is the Ukraine-Russia war. So, to be honest, my question was, because we've seen increasing news of Ukraine attack Russian territory. there were, was it this? There were a bunch of attacks by either Ukrainian forces with remote controlled drones or pro-Ukraine people in Russia. But usually those would be either military attacks or political targets, like they would attack like a city hall or the Kremlin. It would very rarely have any victims, except in the case where what was that media personality? What was his name? No, it was the daughter of Dugin. Dugin, daughter. We don't know if this was directly linked to Ukraine, but seemed likely. So obviously, it was a question whether this attack from a couple of days ago could have been Ukraine. Dugina, I think it's Dugova. So I don't know what the, because you have like names, family names in Russian have to be like changed it based on the gender of the person. Anyway, so one option was Ukraine. Another option that is thrown around a lot online is like CIA special ops kind of thing, covert ops. Duginova, yeah, that sounds right. That could be that. Someone in chat said Russian ultranationalists. Have there been terrorist attacks by Russian ultranationalists recently? I was also thinking Chechen separatists. And of course, ISIS. And this comes a few days after ISIS. We'll look at this article a little bit more, but ISIS did attack the Russian embassy in Kabul, and Russia says they prevented a terror attack on a Moscow synagogue. So what are the possibilities here? Ukraine, my initial thoughts was it's possible, but it doesn't seem to fit their methods. It seemed like they went for way more strategic targets, going after a bunch of civilians. Seemed off to me, and I'm not an expert on the matter, but it just seemed like they would have rather used drones to target, a political, usually buildings, or some kind of factory or something like that. Going for a concert hall seemed really, really off for Ukraine, especially because Ukraine is specifically like calling for international support from Western countries, and that would have looked really, really bad for them. So this seemed basically, oh, there was another option. Russian false flag. So this seemed unlikely to me. Possibly it could have maybe been Ukrainian supporters in Russia with no like direct control or orders from Ukraine, but it just seemed counterproductive. Same thing goes with the CIA. I think the CIA does have some interests in carrying out things in Russia, but attacking a bunch of civilians at a concert hall, I don't see what the US has to gain from that. I don't see how the US gains from the current situation, other than perhaps it makes Putin look really bad. Is it a possibility? Yeah, maybe it might be. Honestly, I would say maybe the CIA is a little bit more likely than Ukraine. But to me, it feels like a huge escalation if anything could be traced directly back to them in a way that is probably not worth it in this case. I don't know much about Russian ultranationalists. If someone has a link to share, in Discord, because I apparently can't see links in so if you want to share it on Discord, share it in the general live stream chat. But I don't know enough about Russian ultranationalists to say whether this is likely or not. Chechen separatists seemed one of the most likely options. ISIS seemed like a possibility, maybe on equal standing with Chechen separatists, because ISIS have been carrying out attacks recently. But Chechen separatists, because they're Russian, have a much bigger presence in Russia than ISIS. Could have been a combination of the two, like ISIS going through Chechen separatists. And finally, Russian false flag. This one I think we can essentially dismiss entirely, because if it had been a Russian false flag, it would be very clearly traceable back to Ukraine or to the United States. And the fact that it is now seeming to be an ISIS attack, unconfirmed, but at least they have claimed it, makes it, yeah, there would have been, let me see if I can find this. Let me quickly look for that. Russia far-right cell. Let me see if I can find these crime scene photos. Did I share it on Facebook at the time? B? Scroll. Nope. Does not seem like I shared it at the time. Okay. Yeah, give me a couple of minutes to look for. Russia had announced that they had arrested members of a pro-Ukraine neo-Nazi group in Russia. And published a photo of the evidence. Oh, I talked about this on stream before. It was yes, this. Okay. Yeah, I just remembered that I talked about this on stream. So yeah, when Russia does a false flag, first of all, they probably would not have killed 130 of their people, because that makes Putin look really bad and really weak. There's allegations that Putin has done false flag attacks in order to gain more power in Russia before. It feels like if they had wanted to do this, they would have probably done the same thing that they did in this case, which was say, hey, we arrested a far-right Ukrainian group that was going to commit an attack, and this is all the evidence that we had. Or at the very least, they would now be showing evidence that the attack was done by pro-Ukrainian people or far-right people or whatever. Okay, that seems like a bit of a spam. This is what they did when they claimed to have thwarted or at least arrested members of a neo-Nazi, a pro-Ukraine neo-Nazi group early in the war. And this is super, super obviously fake. Like I love the wig, the very clearly wig here with green hair. The never worn still has a crease across the front as if it was just straight off the shell. Swastika t-shirts. There's some speculation as to why the fuck the Sims video games are included as evidence of this neo-Nazi ring. And my favorite theory is that The KGB officer in charge told the person who was fabricating the evidence, hey, get some SIM cards to make it look like they're like well connected or whatever. And instead of getting SIM cards, they misunderstood and got copies of the SIMs. That is my favorite theory. There might be more, reasonable theories, but it sounds too hilarious not to be true, basically. If the attack on the concert hall on Friday was a Russian false flag, you would at least see some kind of very clear attribution to Ukraine. And that doesn't seem to be the case. There's the only evidence they basically tried to, and I can maybe start putting the article out on this. Basically, they've been trying to find attributions to Ukraine, saying that the terrorists that they arrested were trying to flee to Ukraine, were caught fleeing to Ukraine. Putin shooter. Not sure. But yeah, they are definitely trying to attribute this to Ukraine, even though ISIS has claimed it. Okay, so that is actually a possible explanation, Tryon, you're saying. The possibilities of why the copies of the Sims were there are basically endless, and all of them are hilarious because there is no way that photo is an actual. I mean, there's the Yako's theory that it's because it's considered gay propaganda fits with the green wig of the possibly like trans-Nazi pro-Ukraine activist or whatever. But yeah, there's no way that photo is an actual, like, that is the most obvious fabricated evidence photo I've ever seen. So ISIS has claimed the attack. There is a video that I'm not going to show, but it's made the rounds on Twitter of basically one of the attackers that was, I don't know if they arrested several, or they definitely arrested at least one, possibly more. And there's a video of one of them basically being tortured and talking about how he was recruited, saying that he was paid a bunch of money, that he was given weapons, and that he's doesn't seem to be like a highly trained, like, connected person. It just seemed to be they found someone who was willing to do it, paid him, and had him do it. It's in Russian, so I've only seen partial subtitles. I'm not going to show like an interrogation video on stream, but it does seem to be most likely by ISIS. My question is, I know this has probably happened before, but I can't think of an instance where a terrorist attack happened and a terrorist group claimed the attack when they actually hadn't done it, because that seems incredibly counterproductive. If a terrorist group, like if a terrorist attack does happen and multiple terrorist groups claim it, that's going to look bad for all of them, because the point of a terrorist group is to be feared, and if it turns out that they're starting to claim credit for attacks that they didn't do, and it's proven, then it looks really bad for them, and they're not going to be as fearsome as they would otherwise be. So I'm sure there are cases, and if any of you know of any cases of a terrorist group falsely claiming an attack, I'm open to it. But it seems like the evidence as we know it right now is ISIS claims the attack, and even though they haven't provided clear evidence, Okay, that's a good example. ISIS claimed the 2017 Las Vegas shooting. ISIS claims Las Vegas shooting. Well, there you go. That's an example. So it's entirely possible that they are falsely claiming it. ISIS claims. You see, this is exactly what I was saying. This is exactly what I meant by it looks really bad for them if they falsely claim it, because it makes them look really bad. It makes them look like they actually have no capability of conducting attacks themselves, so they have to claim responsibility for other attacks. Because if they're claiming like a natural disaster as a terrorist attack, whether it's actually an attack or an accident, like an explosion or something that was actually an accident, we are going to know sooner or later who did it. So the idea that a group would claim responsibility when it actually wasn't them is just really counterproductive for them. So what do we know at this? How did the attack unfold? 20 kilometers from the Kremlin. That is not that far. Was about to host the concert hall was about to host a concert by the group Picnic when gunmen burst into the. This reminds me a lot of the Bataclan attack in France. When gunmen burst into the foyer just after 8 p.m. on Friday evening. So at least 4 people shooting randomly. I've seen analysts talking about the some of the videos that we're definitely not going to show on stream that seem to indicate that these people had no training and were basically amateurs, definitely not military, definitely not special forces, and it didn't seem like they were very experienced handling guns. At some point, fire can be seen inside the hall. So maybe this is what you meant, Tryon, by it's unclear whether they. What the initial claims that I saw were incendiary grenades. The terrorists used a flammable liquid to set fire to the concert hall. So apparently, maybe not incendiary grenades, which I guess would be harder to get than just Molotov cocktails that you can make with, household equipment. Helicopters were, yeah, because the entire building burned down. Who are the victims? This is something maybe I should have made clear earlier in the stream, is obviously there's a lot of anti-Russian people who are happy about this attack and who are saying, yeah, good for Russia, whatever the reasons are, they deserve it. A lot of Ukrainians who, while this attack was happening, people in Ukraine were actually being bombed, like literally at the same time. So obviously they get internet connection back and they see there was an attack. They were like, great, okay, cool, we'll take it. They're happy about it. There is no reason to be happy about this, because this is not achieving anything for anyone. No Russian political or military leader is going to be affected negatively by this. If Russia is able to twist this into a way to make the war in Ukraine even like into drafting even more people to exactly, this is an anti-murder space. If Russia is able to twist this into putting even more resources into Ukraine, this would only be bad for Ukraine. For practical reasons and just for moral reasons, there's no reason to cheer this. It's kind of the same as if you are anti-Israel and October 7th happens, you shouldn't be cheering that, because none of that was, first of all, practically, that was not good for Palestinians. And just morally, the people who were killed in Israel, even if they supported Netanyahu, who most of the people in the areas that were attacked on October 7th did not support Netanyahu. But even if they did, that is not a reason to kill them. And for exactly the same reason, Israelis who are cheering the death of innocent civilians in Gaza, unless they are actual Hamas fighters, in which case they're legitimate targets in a war, it is not a legit, like, it is not a reason. The possibility of those people supporting Hamas is not a reason to want to cheer their, essentially, their murder, their death. That should be obvious, but unfortunately, people will just say Russia bad guy, therefore everyone in Russia bad guy. And it is true that, right, keeping an eye on your next message, it is true that Putin has a lot of support in Russia, obviously. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Let me get back to this. There's a lot of reasons why dictators have a lot of support, and it's kind of inconvenient. We would like to think that, oh yeah, bad, evil dictator, therefore the people are going to rise up against them, or they're evil. And the reality is, people like strong leaders. Firstly, there's always going to be a minimum level of support for a charismatic anti-democracy person in any country. In the most pro-democracy country on earth, if someone comes in with a forceful, Trump-style personality or Bolsonaro-style personality and says, oh yeah, we just need to, like fascism, we just need to return to the greatness of the country and all of that, and get rid of all of these liberal democratic institutions, there's always going to be a base level of support for that. And those are not people that I support, but those are not people that I consider to be legitimate targets to kill either. And once you have that minimum level of support and you get to the point where you're in power, you then can control the narrative. You control the media, you control what people are allowed to say and are allowed to see on social media, and you get to the point where you can get a much higher level of support than that base level of support. So it is not, whatever actions Russia is doing in Ukraine or elsewhere, it is not the fault of these civilians, considering that one, Russia is not a democracy, and two, a lot of them are just being manipulated by the media in ways that anyone in any country would be susceptible to if the same tactics were employed on them. And in a lot of countries, they are being employed on them, like, the pro-Trump movement in the US. It is the level of support of Russia is definitely not as high as we see it, for example, in the election where he had 90%, but it is still probably a majority of the country. I don't know exactly what the numbers are. Polls are, I don't know how reliable polls are, and we can definitely talk about that with the Russian journalist that we'll have on stream next week. But it is undeniable that Putin does have a lot of support, even if it's not quite as high as he likes to present it as. So Gray, that video I posted last week about telescopes had a segment on Hamas from a Libyan's point of view. Can you resend that video in the stream chat, or just send it to me as a DM on Discord? Exactly, Yako. The Putin's base of support, and generally, okay, we're not going to watch 3 hours long. I had other ideas for things we could watch that are that are multiple hours long that we might get to tonight. But I'm not going to tack on another one. But yeah, the base of support for conservatives in general, which Putin is one, is boomers who've been kind of, influenced by not just propaganda, but also just conservative culture in general for their entire lives. So yeah, we shouldn't, no matter what, no matter which country this happens in, to which people this happens to, civilians should always be off limits and should never be a thing that we celebrate. So by Sunday afternoon, at least 137 people have been confirmed dead. and at least 60 remain in serious condition. Who are the attackers? Apparently, 11 people have been arrested, including 4 directly involved. And I would assume that 4 directly involved means 4 shooters. So we said there were at least 4 shooters up above. And it seems that if that's as many shooters as there were, they were all arrested. Which is good. That is good news, because if they hadn't been arrested, it is very likely that they would have just... It would have been extremely hard for them to get out of the country or to lay low to the point where they would never been arrested. So once they had the means and they still had the weapons after fleeing, it would have been very likely for them to just do another attack shortly after. So if all of them were arrested, which hopefully that is the case, that is good news for Russian civilians. Their identities have not been announced. Unconfirmed reports. Okay. This is unconfirmed nationals from Tajikistan, so let's not worry about that too much right now. Who was behind the attack? In a brief statement on Friday, IS, Islamic State, said it was behind the attack. I believe this is what's called ISIS-K, which is I think most of their presence right now is in Afghanistan. They killed a bunch of people in Iran at a memorial for an Iranian general who was killed under Trump by the US a few years ago. And they've been fighting the Taliban since they took over in Afghanistan again. So it seems like most of ISIS has been thrown out of Iraq and Syria, where they originally had most of their operations, and now most of their presence is in Afghanistan. But again, hopefully we can have my friend, who's not like specifically an ISIS specialist, but has written about ISIS recently, and who can tell us more in depth about the situation with ISIS right now. Marathon, you all read foreign news there. Well, I don't speak Russian, so... Which is propagated by the United States. This is the BBC. No one tried to understand the situation. We are trying to understand the situation. We ran through a bunch of different scenarios. Naturally, there is propaganda against a strong country, competitors. Okay, I don't even know what that is supposed to say. So yeah, note there is a few mostly Muslim provinces. Yeah, there's Dagestan. There's a few Muslim provinces in Russia, and it's not surprising that ISIS would have some contacts there, some level of a network there. But yeah, a lot of this seems to be speculation. What we know is that ISIS has claimed responsibility. It released a photograph of what it says was the 4 attackers, all masked. Okay, well, that's kind of useless. Later released a highly graphic footage from the attack. The video, which has been verified by the BBC as genuine, shows one of the gunmen opening fire on several people. The BBC will not be broadcasting this video. Yeah, no shit. Russian authorities have not commented on the ISIS claim. Yeah, let's look at the the warning that the US gave Russia before the attack. The main warning from the US is to its own citizens in Russia. And for a while, this was the the U.S. embassy in Russia page saying avoid large gatherings over the next. This is not specifically for the last few weeks. When was this published? They say over the next 48 hours, but if they don't give the date on which this was published, that's kind of vague. On March 7th. Okay, so it was a while ago. So yeah, 2 weeks ago, they did warn of the embassy is monitoring reports that extremists have imminent plans to target large gatherings in Moscow to include concerts, and U.S. citizens should be advised to avoid large gatherings over the next 48 hours. U.S. warning Russia attack. The warning is like the warning is incredibly specific. Why would the BBC make the video not available? Because the video shows people getting killed and the BBC doesn't broadcast that. Like, if you really want to go find ISIS channels where they have shared the video, you can do that, but the BBC is not going to share those for completely understandable reasons. So, the Moscow attack raises particularly difficult issues for Vladimir Putin at a time of international tension and mistrust. Yeah, the fact that they were warned makes this look really bad for Putin. It's kind of like the very true fact that there were a bunch of warnings, maybe not as specific as plans to target large gatherings, including concerts, but there were warnings given to the U.S. ahead of 9/11, and the October 7th attack also had a bunch of warnings. First of all, a bunch of Arab countries warned Israel, and it turned out that one of Israel's analysts had been warning her chain of command for 1 year ahead of the attack. But the problem is, these are entire countries. There's literally so many targets, and there's no specific time frame. The US said 48 hours. Turned out that it happened 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks later. So just being vigilant about every large gathering in a huge area all the time. Same thing with with October 7th, which is like, oh, there might be an attack anytime in the next couple of years in basically any place near Palestinian territory, is not really actionable intelligence. And what I've seen was basically Russia saying that they had not been given specific information. This is very specific. And it seems like this could have been actionable. Hey, let's just have extra security at large gatherings, including concerts, for the next few months. And the terrorists can read the announcements too, but I mean, yeah, but clearly the announcements didn't really do anything in terms of any kind of Russian security response. But yeah. In a city of 20 million, yeah. I just wonder how many concerts happened in the last month. It's still a lot. It's still a lot to cover, and there's always, if the terrorists had showed up and they saw, oh wait, there's extra security, let's just wait a few more days and go to another. Like, the terrorists always have the advantage in these kinds of situations. So it's not as simple as just, oh yeah, let's just add security everywhere. But it's Russia. They're famous for their counterintelligence and their spies. So I still need to install. And I can't read this. Okay. The US government also shared this information with Russian authorities in accordance with longstanding duty to warn policy. Yeah, makes sense. But the problem is that Moscow dismissed the warning. I think I saw something about Putin calling it blackmail. So Putin claimed that Ukraine had switched to what he called terrorist tactics in response to in reference to usually drone attacks on, like, it's not like, big drones, but usually it's small explosive drone attacks on either political targets like political buildings or military, like landing strips, things like that. Yeah, he said the warnings resemble outright blackmail and the intention is to intimidate or destabilize our society. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was saying, Tryon. You can't perfectly protect against every target. It should help, and if they had listened to the warning, maybe they could have been a little bit more prepared, but that doesn't mean that they would have been able to, like, prevent any possible terrorist attack everywhere. Anyway, at the moment, that seems to be all we know. It doesn't seem to be 100% confirmed that it's ISIS yet, but that was the main suspect, like the main target of speculation on the night of the attack. And a few hours after they were already being speculated about, they claimed responsibility, seem to have released at least some evidence, even though it's very vague evidence. So that's where we are now, and hopefully next week we can have people who know more than me to talk about that way more into detail. The other thing that happened this week is the presidential election. The timing here would have been really interesting. I wonder what would have happened if the two had been flipped timing-wise and the presidential election had happened after the attack, if that would have made a big difference in the results. But anyway, Putin got, unsurprisingly, not just a victory, but a nearly 90% victory. Which is the most predictable result in the history of elections. Let me make sure that elections. Yeah, 100. So there's what country was this in? There's a country. It's one of the stands. I don't remember if it was It was a country in Central Asia. It might have been Azerbaijan, so not one of the stands, but a country in Central Asia where they had released an app with updates on election results ahead of the election. Like, hey, everyone, download this app if you want live updates on the vote counting, etc. And the day before the election, they accidentally published the results of the election, which is amazing. They had already done all the math ahead of time, and they published not just a general result, but the full breakdown, region by region, of how many people had voted in the presidential election that hadn't happened yet. This was like 8 or 10 years ago or something like that. Hilarious. Wait, let me see if I can. Yeah, Azerbaijan. It was Azerbaijan. Oops, Azerbaijan released election results before voting had even started. Brilliant. Yeah, no, I agree, because this makes it incredibly. I mean, it's still interesting, and we'll get into some interesting things. But I mean, this is kind of interesting too, in a way. It's like it's it's not interesting in the same way that following, like, oh, this or that party, what tactics are they using, how are they trying to appeal to voters. It's not interesting in the same way. But it's still interesting for sure. There was another. Um, this was a colleague of mine when I worked in China. Um, a few colleagues of mine had done a reporting trip to North Korea, because North Korea is not as closed as people think it is. You can actually go there as a tourist. Very like recommended against. Um, I had friends who worked for a tour company called what was it called? Young Pioneers. And Young Pioneers, their motto is, as a tour company, this is a super cool concept. Their motto is, "We take you to places your mother would rather you stay away from." So they had tours in, I think they did Kazakhstan, Iran, and I think they probably did a few African countries, and they did North Korea. And unfortunately, I what do you mean? I love the North Korean presidential debates. Can you imagine a presidential debate in North Korea with like everyone except Kim Jong Un with a gun to their head, like big drop of sweat leaking down their face. But anyway, Young Pioneers is, I believe, and do not take me at face value on this. I would have to confirm that. Let me just confirm that live now. But I believe that was a tour that Otto Warmbier, the American citizen who was imprisoned in North Korea a few years ago and then was released to the US in a coma, and then he died before waking up from his coma, was actually captured while um on a Young Pioneer tour in North Korea. I think that is the case. Otto Warmbier, Young Pioneer. Yep, exactly. So yeah, not good, but definitely interesting. I was super at the time when I was there, was before Otto Warmbier was captured, and I was actually really tempted to do it. Um, yeah, I'm seeing a headline here. I was so lucky to avoid Otto Warmbier's fate in North Korea. I guess I could kind of say the same thing. Although a lot of people did go through, they had never had this issue before, and they had been doing those tours for years. It is definitely a risky decision to make. But anyway, so colleagues of mine went there on a reporting trip that was organized by a different tour company. And one of them, the article that he published, was one of my favorite opening paragraphs to a magazine article ever. I don't remember exactly the wording, but he basically walked to a hotel lobby in North Korea and went to, "Hey, do you have the newspaper from today?" And um, front desk person said, "No, sorry, we ran out of today's newspaper, but we have tomorrow's if you want." Welcome to North Korea. Welcome to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The only place where tomorrow's news is written today. Remember, lads, don't steal posters. Yeah, especially not in North Korea. Anyway, there was an anecdote that I did want to talk about just to illustrate how elections work in Russia. You know about Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident who had a really interesting life, and in the last few years of his life, he was poisoned in Russia, treated in Germany. When he returned to Russia after waking up from his treatment, yeah. By the way, I still have this thing that I picked up at a protest in Berlin a few years ago. I still have this that I picked up at a protest a few years ago. This was when he was being treated in Germany, actually. No, it was actually right after he returned to Russia. So this is the balls that this guy had. He was on probation in Russia because he was a political dissident, was poisoned in Russia, got into a coma. While in a coma, so he had no choice in leaving Russia. He was sent to Germany while in a coma to be treated for his poisoning. And then he wakes up in Germany and decides to go back to Russia once he's healed, knowing full well that he had just been poisoned there. And he was actually arrested for violating his parole because his parole said he wasn't allowed to leave the country. Which is insane. Like, think about that for a second. The guy was sent outside of the country while in a coma and arrested for that. Yeah, I think Putin said something like, oh, it's unfortunate that he died right before being traded. Anyway, so he is arrested because he violated his parole while in a coma. Complete mock trial, sent to a gulag, and recently died in a gulag. So he had an entire organization. He had a party, a bunch of people running for that party in elections. That party was labeled a terrorist organization or an extremist organization in Russia. But a few years ago, I believe it was someone from that party. Let me find the exact election. Whoa, something is happening with. Hopefully this doesn't damage, like this doesn't repeat itself. Anyway, it was St. Petersburg. Yes. Jeff saying, I went to the North Korea Pavilion at the Shanghai Expo in 2010. It was really bare bones and kitschy. On the wall, there was the motto in English, North Korea, paradise for people. Yeah, paradise for people. Nova Zemlya, I'm guessing that's the prison where Navalny was. Has not been a gulag since 1994. How dare you defame? Yeah. Well, I mean, penitentiary camp, if you want to call it that. I don't think that makes it much better. Anyway, a few years ago, one of these three guys, I do not know which one it is, was running, I'm pretty sure, for the, what was it, a mayoral election? St. Petersburg election? Was it like a municipal election? Okay. So one of these guys called Boris Wisniewski was running for in the municipal elections, and the government had two lookalikes run in the election as well and legally change their names to Boris Wisniewski so that voters would go there and go, wait, which Boris Wisniewski am I supposed to vote for here? And that is the most creative way to suppress your opposition that I've ever seen, to be honest. I would have never in a million years thought that's the way a government would do that. Props for creativity, I have to say, because that is pretty impressive in terms of the level of dedication that they would go to. They could have had them have like plastic surgery or something, but yeah. Did it? Which country are you from, Martin? Yeah, you pointed to the wrong Boris. Okay, well, I don't know which one the right Boris is. I could do the John Oliver thing of this Boris Wisniewski, except that is not Boris Wisniewski. Actually, Boris Wisniewski is this one here. So, this has happened in Hungary. Do you have an article for that? That's really interesting. I wonder, did it happen before? Because this was in 2021. Did it happen recently, more recently than this, or did Hungary get the idea from this, or is this just a regular thing that happens in a bunch of countries? It does seem kind of fun if you have all the powers to do this kind of shit. Like coming up with these ideas is must be fun. Must be a fun job to have. So yeah, the GOP did this in Florida, did they? Anyway, so yeah, we'll talk more about the Russian election and the attack next weekend for sure. I wanted to quickly go over this because it is really weird. If any of you have seen the most recent John Oliver video on Boeing, there's a lot happening with Boeing. I guess people started to get really concerned about this a few years ago when there was the famous Boeing 737 Max that would basically have an autopilot feature that would automatically crash the plane if anything wrong happened to like one tiny sensor on the plane. And since then, things have been just getting worse. I actually have a family member who works for Airbus, and at the time when that was happening, I was asking him, hey, what do you think of this? And his answer really, really scared me because he said, yeah, we're really sad for them, for the people at Boeing, because this could happen to anyone. And that freaked me out coming from the rival manufacturer because when I asked him that question, it was already incredibly clear that the whole 737 Max was just a series of terrible management decisions and just. Is it only stuttering for you? Oh shit, is it stuttering? Let me check on my side. Testing 1 2. Twitch seems to be fine. Okay. Hopefully it's not a problem from my side. Hopefully it's not too bad. Anyway, so yeah, it was clear that it was a string of essentially negligence from Boeing at the time. So the fact that someone at Airbus, who is not like a high level decision maker or anything like that, would be like, oh yeah, this is really sad. This could have happened to us too, kind of freaked me out. I really hope that he was just not really keeping up to date with the latest developments in the Boeing situation, and that had he been keeping up to date, he would have said, yeah, they really fucked up. It's their fault. Or that he was just being kind to them by saying, oh, yeah, this could have happened to anyone. But yeah, it was kind of freaky. I would assume that he was well informed because he worked for Airbus. But yeah, it didn't. Airbus does seem to have a better safety track record, so it seems like it's not happening to them, and just Boeing is having disaster after disaster in recent weeks as well. A plane, a door falling off, a wheel falling off, stuff like that. And in the middle of that, a Boeing whistleblower who had worked for, I think he worked for 17 years for Boeing. "32 years until 2017." That's the 17 that I had in mind. Was actually providing information to U.S. authorities saying that Boeing had been using scrap, basically when they were putting together the planes, when they found a defective piece, they would put it in a scrap bin. And later on, when they needed a piece like that and they couldn't find any, and they wanted to avoid delays in the production of the plane, they would just dip into the scrap bin to get the defective pieces and put those on the aircraft. That's what he was alleging. He was also alleging that they were using like dish soap as a lubricant in some cases, stuff like that, just like terrible, terrible practices. And mysteriously, in the middle of Boeing having this horrible PR crisis of probably also losing a bunch of money in terms of their stock price, this whistleblower is found dead of apparently a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Now, again, entirely possible that it was self-inflicted, that he did off himself. And, not jumping to conclusions here, not accusing Boeing of anything, but this is definitely suspicious. The timing is really weird. And yeah, let me look at that, telling his friends he doesn't plan to suicide, because I heard that thing was a little dubious. What's his name? John Barnett. Let's see if there's any more recent information. Okay, from Newsweek. Boeing whistleblower warned family friend it's not suicide before death. Police are investigating. Single gunshot wound to the head. Found with what officers described as a silver handgun and a white piece of paper that closely resembled a note. What is a white piece of paper that closely resembled a note? Do you not know if there's a note? Do you not know if it's a note? I don't understand what this means. Speaking to ABC News 4, Jennifer, who didn't give a surname and was described by the network as a close family friend of Barnett, claimed he told her not to believe any reports of his suicide sometime before his death. That's all? That's it? Okay, no, wait. She claimed he insisted, "I ain't scared," before adding, "but if anything happens to me, it's not suicide." That is more than suspicious. Parchment, I guess. Yeah, the suicide note written in parchment. Anyway, so she said, "I know he did not commit suicide. There's no way. He loved life too much. He loved his family too much. He loved his brothers too much to put them through what they're going through right now. I think somebody didn't like what he had to say and wanted to shut him up and didn't want it to come back on anyone, so that's why they made it look like a suicide." Well, yeah, that's the classic, like the kind of the obvious alternative explanation to he actually did it himself. Newsweek is unable to independently verify the claim made by the reported family friend. I mean, this could be a hoax. It happens all the time, unfortunately. Could just have someone looking for attention, someone wanting to be on the news, even anonymously. But it's definitely worth just keeping an open mind to the possibilities here. Yeah, so he was working at the Charleston plant, and he said, "I haven't seen a plane out of Charleston yet that I'd put my name on saying it's safe and airworthy." That is concerning when it comes to flying on any kind of Boeing plane right now. Yeah, I imagine. I guess what you could do is have a kind of dead man switch. Oh, if anyone decides to do anything to me, if I don't click this link every 24 hours with a password that only I know, a bunch of extra information is going to be published. And you could have something like that if you have damning information on a company and want to avoid being suicided. But yeah, incredibly, incredibly suspicious stuff. Yeah, Jeff, that's the thing in I think John Oliver had that in his video on Boeing a couple of weeks ago, where most of the people working on the planes were saying, "Yeah, I would definitely not fly on this plane," and one of them was like, "Yeah, I would fly, but I have kind of a death wish, so yeah." 7D chess move to commit suicide to win is committing suicide to win the lawsuit. I'm not sure that's the way to go. Anyway, I was asked to take a look at this. Okay, so these are polling results in Austria. And I don't know that much about Austrian politics. And this is a poll, I think. It's not an election as far as I know. Oh no, it is an election. Okay. Okay, I think this is, wait, let me see. Yeah, these are like local state elections. Who's SPO and KPO? I would assume, yeah, that's the Social Democrats and the Communists had a decent chunk. 27 and 24. Wow, they had over 50% together. Okay. That's good for them. It is very local election though, so I'm not sure it's worth going that much in depth in, but I definitely need to do more to read more about Austrian politics and figure out what exactly is going on there. I mean, hasn't the far right been more than just gaining ground, but has spent some time in power? Like maybe not the far right, but the borderline far right a few years ago already. Tryon, you wrote me a couple of days ago about Bulgarian politics. Have you made that video that you were talking about? You did. Cool. Would you like to send it over? Want to keep it for next stream? Do you wanna have a look at it now? Okay, well, when you finish your 20-minute thing, we can have a look at it for sure if you want. We can watch it on stream. I wanted to propose multiple possibilities of stuff to watch tonight. I'm tempted to end stream early and like leave bigger stuff for next weekend, especially if we're gonna have like an interview or two interviews next weekend about the situation in Russia and more developments about the attack. But yeah, there's a debate on Israel Palestine that kind of went viral. I mean, unsurprisingly, went viral a couple of weeks ago between Destiny, famous streamer Destiny, and three academics. And I was wondering if you guys would be interested in having a look, because what I find interesting in this debate, I think it's mostly going to be very unsurprising talking points going back and forth for literally 5 hours is the length of the debate, but it would definitely cover a lot of ground. And what I find interesting is that the Destiny side, the Destiny kind of ecosystem, is saying you have to be delusional to think that the pro-Palestine side, which was mainly represented by Finkelstein, a very famous Jewish pro-Palestinian historian, academic, I'm not sure exactly what his title is. You have to be delusional to think that the Finkelstein side of the debate won, is what the Destiny ecosystem, like streamer bubble, says, and the pro-Palestine version, like side of things and side of Twitter says you have to be delusional to think that the Destiny side of the debate won. And I find that kind of interesting that those two like very, very contradictory. I mean, it's unsurprising, but I was tempted to go over it and kind of keep an open mind, because as much as I'm very much, yeah, exactly. Like that's the point that I wanted to make. This is why I'm kind of interested in maybe covering it, because the thing is, first, there is essentially, I'm not going to say that there's zero overlap, but being right and winning a debate are two completely um unrelated things. There's an overlap between the two. It's not like it's completely exclusionary, and it's probably easier to win a debate when you are right, but someone who is really good at debating can often win debates while being wrong. It is those are two very different, like the like winning a debate is a skill that has almost nothing to do or very little to do with actually having the facts on your side. So there's that. And the other thing is, I think Destiny is, one, an incredibly good debater. Two, as much as I disagree with him on a lot of topics, I think he's an incredibly smart guy. And he's on his side of the debate was Benny Morris, who's a very right wing Israeli historian, but also someone who's very respected in his domain of expertise and has pushed back on some Israeli narratives, although he also has some very cringe, essentially pro ethnic cleansing views, where he was basically saying that they should have done more during the Nakba to push out more Palestinians, and that would have been better for everyone in the long run, which is kind of a crazy take. But anyway, Destiny is smart. Benny Morris is very respected as a historian, as much as you can disagree with both of them on their Israeli takes. And on the other side, even though I do tend to lean pro-Palestinian, I don't know enough about the other person who was on the side with Finkelstein. But Finkelstein, although a very loud, bombastic pro-Palestinian voice, is a massive piece of shit who is wrong on a lot of things. And him having the right general position on Palestine does not mean that he is going to be using the best arguments. Like this guy also argues that Russia had the right to invade Ukraine. Is also very conservative, socially speaking, very anti. Like, no, I don't know if he's very anti-LGBT, but has made some anti-LGBT statements. Just is wrong on a lot of issues. He just happens to be pro-Palestinian, which doesn't necessarily mean that he would, be the best voice to represent that side. So I've only seen a bunch of clips of the debate, and I was curious to maybe try to go over the whole thing and actually see all of those segments in context and kind of assess if we think it's as clear cut as both sides try to present it as. Is that something you're interested in looking at, or is there another big news story that you would like to do? My camera is really misbehaving these days. I think it's the cable connection that's not working too well. Because it is a 5-hour long debate, so we're definitely not going to, if we do watch it, we're definitely not going to watch the whole thing tonight. We could keep it for a later stream. We could watch half of it now and maybe half of it in a later stream or something like that. Let's maybe do okay, let's do this. Say either yes or no in chat now. Okay, it seems like it's a pretty overwhelming yes. Let's go for it. Let me look for the actual video. Wait, let me watch this on my account so we don't have the ads. I'm looking for the 5-hour one. And it is this one. Okay. I am, let me do something. I will use my wireless earphones, so while we listen to this, I can go, like, make myself a coffee, and I don't have to pause while I'm away from the keyboard. Let me get those. I'll be right back. Okay. Let's put this at titles a little bit faster, and let's go. Oh yeah, I was about to say that. Please like and share or at least like the stream. And if you want to support me and what I do, feel free to. And if you want to test the on-screen alerts for donations, feel free to donate either through a super chat or through the link that's under in the stream description on YouTube. And there's also a button somewhere on the Twitch page to donate through there. Let's go. And so I'm going to start the video, and I'm going to get... Let me just find the actual start of the debate, and then I'll go get a coffee while we listen to it. Wait a second. I have a problem here. Audio. Let me fix this. I think I messed up the audio by using my Bluetooth earphone. Yep, it's not working. Okay, I can't use the Bluetooth audio, unfortunately. Back to this.
To the turn up.
There we go. Okay, in that case, I will just put the beginning of the thing, make myself a coffee, and then I'll come back and we can watch it.
That's a good point. No, it's a good point.
Now, some people accuse me of speaking very slowly, and they're advised on YouTube to turn up the speed twice to 3 times whenever I'm on. One of the reasons I speak slowly is because I attach value to every word I say.
Norm will say this all over and over and over again. I only deal in facts. I don't deal in hypotheticals. I only deal in facts. I only deal in facts. And that seems to be the case, except for when the facts are completely and totally contrary to the particular point you're trying to push. The idea that Jews would have out of hand rejected any state that had Arabs on it or always had a plan of expulsion is just betrayed by the acceptance of the 47 partition
I don't
plan.
think you understand politics.
They forced the British to prevent emigration of Jews from Europe and reaching safe shores in Palestine. That's what they did.
And
they knew that the Jews were being persecuted in Europe.
Was Palestine the only spot of land on earth?
Yes, basically that was the problem. The Jews couldn't emigrate.
What about your great friends in Britain, the architects of the Balfour Declaration?
By the late 1930s,
what about the United
weren't
States?
Happy to take in Jews, and the Americans weren't happy to take in Jews.
And why are Palestinians, who are not Europeans, who had zero role in the rise of Nazism, who had no relation to any of this, why are they somehow uniquely responsible for what happened in Europe and uniquely
culpable? The only safe haven for Jews.
Professor Morris, because of your logic, and I'm not disputing it, that's why October 7th happened.
Oh my God.
Because there was no options left for those people.
The Hamas guys who attacked the kibbutzim, apart from the attacks on the military sites, when they attacked the kibbutzim, were out to kill civilians, and they killed family after family, house after house.
Talk fast. So people think that you're coherent.
I'm just reading from the UN.
Yeah, but
I know you like them sometimes. Only when they agree with you, though. But you've lied about this particular instance in the past. Those kids weren't just on the beaches as often stated in articles. Those kids were literally coming out of a previously identified Hamas compound that they had operated from. They literally
Mr. Borelli, with all due respect, you're such a fantastic moron. It's terrifying.
The following is a debate on the topic of Israel and Palestine with Norman Finkelstein, Benny Morris, Muin Rabbani, and Stephen Bennell, also known online as Destiny. Norm and Benny are historians, Muin is a Middle East analyst, and Stephen is a political commentator and streamer. All 4 have spoken and debated extensively on this topic. The goal for this debate was not for anyone to win or to score points. It wasn't to get views or likes. I never care about those. And I think there are probably much easier ways to get those things if I did care. The goal was to explore, together, the history, present, and future of Israel and Palestine in a free-flowing conversation. No time limits, no rules. There was a lot of tension in the room from the very beginning, and it only got more intense as we went along. And I quickly realized that this very conversation, in a very real human way, was a microcosm of the tensions and distance and perspectives on the topic of Israel.
Sorry for the level. I hope that wasn't completely horrible for 2 minutes there. But yeah, hopefully it's fixed now. Let me know if you want me to lower, raise it later on. I'll keep a closer eye on the level now.
Israel and Palestine. For some debates, I will step in and moderate strictly to prevent emotion from boiling. For this, I saw the value in not interfering with the passion of the exchanges, because that emotion in itself spoke volumes. We did talk about the history and the future, but the anger, the frustration, the biting wit, and at times respect and camaraderie were all there. Like I said, we did it in an perhaps all too human way. I will do more debates and conversations on these difficult topics, and I will continue to search for hope in the midst of death and destruction, to search for our common humanity in the midst of division and hate. This thing we have going on, human civilization, the whole of it, is beautiful.
Okay, let's skip ahead to the debate.
And now, Stephen, 48 is the establishment of the state of... This question is about 1948. For Israelis, 1948 is the establishment of the State of Israel and the War of Independence. For Palestinians, 1948 is the Nakba, which means catastrophe, or the displacement of 700,000 Palestinians from their homes as a consequence of the war. What to you is important to understand about the events of 1948 and the period around there, 47, 49, that helps us understand what's going on today, and maybe helps us understand the roots of all of this that started even before 1948. I was hoping that Norm can speak first, then Benny, then Muin, and then Norm.
After World War II, the British decided that they didn't want to deal with the Palestine question anymore, and the ball was thrown into the court of the United Nations. Now, as I read the record, the UN was not attempting to arbitrate or adjudicate rights and wrongs. It was confronting a very practical problem. There were two national communities in Palestine, and there were irreconcilable differences on fundamental questions, most importantly, looking at the historic record on the question of immigration, and associate with the question of immigration, the question of land. The UN Special Committee on Palestine, which came into being before the UN 181 partition resolution, the UN Special Committee, it recommended two states in Palestine. There was a minority position represented by Iran, India, Yugoslavia. They supported one state, but they believed that if forced to, the two communities would figure out some sort of modus vivendi and live together. United Nations General Assembly supported partition between what it called a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, in my reading of the record, and I understand there's new scholarship on the subject, which I've not read, but so far as I've read the record, there's no clarity on what the United Nations General Assembly meant by a Jewish state and an Arab state, except for the fact that the Jewish state would be demographically, the majority would be Jewish, and the Arab state demographically would be Arab. The UNSCOP, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, it was very clear, and it was reiterated many times, that in recommending two states, each state, the Arab state and the Jewish state, would have to guarantee full equality of all citizens with regard to political, civil, and religious matters. Now, that does raise the question, if there is absolute full equality of all citizens, both in the Jewish state and the Arab state, with regard to political rights, civil rights, and religious rights, apart from the demographic majority, it's very unclear what it meant to call a state Jewish or call a state Arab. In my view, the partition resolution was the correct decision. I do not believe that the Arab and Jewish communities could, at that point, be made to live together. I disagree with the minority position of India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, and that not being a practical option, two states was the only other option. In this regard, I would want to pay tribute to what was probably the most moving speech at the UN General Assembly proceedings by the Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko. I was very tempted to quote it at length, but I recognized that would be taking too much time. So I asked a young friend, Jamie Stern Weiner, to edit it and just get the essence of what Foreign Minister Gromyko had to say. During the last war, Gromyko said, the Jewish people underwent exceptional sorrow and suffering. Without any exaggeration, this sorrow and suffering are indescribable. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are wandering about in various countries of Europe in search of means of existence and in search of shelter. The United Nations cannot and must not regard this situation with indifference. Past experience, particularly during the Second World War, shows that no Western European state was able to provide adequate assistance for the Jewish people in defending its rights and its very existence from the violence of the Hitlerites and their allies. This is an unpleasant fact, but unfortunately, like all other facts, it must be admitted. Gromyko went on to say, in principle, he supports one state, or the Soviet Union supports one state. But, he said, if relations between the Jewish and Arab populations of Palestine proved to be so bad that it would be impossible to reconcile them and to ensure the peaceful coexistence of the Arabs and the Jews, the Soviet Union would support two states. I personally am not convinced that the two states would have been unsustainable in the long term if, and this is a big if, the Zionist movement had been faithful to the position it proclaimed during the UNSCOP public hearings. At the time, Ben-Gurion testified, quote, I want to express what we mean by a Jewish state. We mean by a Jewish state simply a state where the majority of the people are Jews, not a state where a Jew has in any way any privilege more than anyone else. A Jewish state means a state based on absolute equality of all her citizens and on democracy. Alas, this was not to be. As Professor Morris has written, quote, Zionist ideology and practice were necessarily and elementally expansionist. And then he wrote in another book, transfer, the euphemism for expulsion, transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism because it sought to transform a land which was Arab into a Jewish state. And a Jewish state could not have arisen without a major displacement of Arab population. And because this aim automatically produced resistance among the Arabs, which in turn persuaded the Yeshuv's leaders, the Yeshuv being the Jewish community, the Yeshuv's leaders that a hostile Arab majority or a large minority could not remain in place if a Jewish state was to arise or safely endure. Or, as Professor Morris retrospectively put it, quote, a removing of a population was needed. Without a population expulsion, a Jewish state would not have been established, unquote. The Arab side rejected outright the partition resolution. I won't play games with that. I know a lot of people tried to prove it's not true. It clearly, in my view, is true. The Arab side rejected outright the partition resolution, while Israeli leaders, acting under compulsions inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism, found the pretext in the course of the first Arab-Israeli war to expel the indigenous population and expand its borders. I therefore conclude that neither side was committed to the letter of the partition resolution, and both sides aborted it.
Thank you, Norm. Norm asked that you make a lengthy statement in the beginning. Benny, I hope it's okay to call everybody by their first name in the name of camaraderie. Norm has quoted several things you said. Perhaps you can comment broadly on the question of 1948 and maybe respond to the things that Norm said.
Yeah. UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, recommended partition. The majority of UNSCOP recommended partition, which was accepted by the UN General Assembly in November 1947, essentially looking back to the Peel Commission in 1937. 10 years earlier, a British commission had looked at the problem of Palestine, the two warring national groups who refused to live together, if you like, or consolidate a unitary state between them. And Peel said there should be two states. That's the principle. The country must be partitioned into two states. This would give a modicum of justice to both sides, if not all their demands, of course. And the United Nations followed suit. The United Nations, UNSCOP, and then the UN General Assembly, representing the will of the international community, said two states is the just solution in this complex situation. The problem was that immediately with the passage of the resolution, the Arab states and the Arabs of Palestine said no, as Norman Finkelstein said. They said no, they rejected the partition idea, the principle of partition, not just the idea of what percentage which side should get, but the principle of partition they said no to. The Jews should not have any part of Palestine for their sovereign territory. Maybe Jews could live as a minority in Palestine. That also was problematic in the eyes of the Palestinian Arab leadership. Husseini had said only Jews who were there before 1917 could actually get citizenship and continue to live there. But the Arabs rejected partition, and the Arabs of Palestine launched, in very disorganized fashion, war against the resolution, against the implementation of the resolution, against the Jewish community in Palestine. And this was their defeat in that civil war between the two communities while the British were withdrawing from Palestine, led to the Arab invasion, the invasion by the Arab states in May 1948 of the country. Again, basically with the idea of eradicating or preventing the emergence of a Jewish state in line with the United Nations decision and the will of the international community. Norman said that the Zionist enterprise, and he quoted me, meant from the beginning to transfer or expel the Arabs of Palestine, or some of the Arabs of Palestine. And I think he's sort of quoting out of context. The context in which the statements were made that the Jewish state could only emerge if there was a transfer of Arab population was preceded, in the way I wrote it and the way it actually happened, by Arab resistance and hostilities towards the Jewish community. Had the Arabs accepted partition, there would have been a large Arab minority in the Jewish state, which emerged in 47. And in fact, Jewish economists and state builders took into account that there would be a large Arab minority and its needs would be cared for, etc. But this was not to be, because the Arabs attacked. And had they not attacked, perhaps a Jewish state with a large Arab minority could have emerged, but this didn't happen. They went to war, the Jews resisted, and in the course of that war, Arab populations were driven out. Some were expelled, some left because Arab leaders advised them to leave or ordered them to leave. And at the end of the war, Israel said they can't return because they just tried to destroy the Jewish state. And that's the basic reality of what happened in 48. The Jews created a state. The Palestinian Arabs never bothered to even try to create a state before 48 and in the course of the 1948 war. And for that reason, they have no state to this day. The Jews do have a state because they prepared to establish a state, fought for it, and established it, hopefully lastingly.
When you say hostility, in case people are not familiar, there was a full-on war where Arab states invaded, and Israel won that war.
Let me just add to clarify. The war had two parts to it. The first part was the Arab community in Palestine, its militiamen, attacked the Jews from November 1947. In other words, from the day after the UN partition resolution was passed, Arab gunmen were busy shooting up Jews, and that snowballed into a full-scale civil war between the two communities in Palestine. In May 1948, a second stage began in the war in which the Arab states invaded the new state, attacked the new state, and they too were defeated, and thus a state of Israel emerged. In the course of this two-stage war, a vast Palestinian refugee problem occurred.
And so after that, the transfer, the expulsion, the thing that people call the Nakba happened. Muin, could you speak to 1948 and the historical significance of it?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, I'm not gonna intervene much when it comes to the technicalities, because I'm definitely not as much. I don't know as much as three of these people, and honestly, I don't even know as much as Destiny has been doing a lot of research on his stream. We haven't heard him speak yet, but what's really interesting to me, having watched a lot of the things that Destiny has been saying on his stream, is he now knows a hell of a lot about the history of the region. But what I've noticed, one of the first conversations he had after October 7th with, I think was a history professor or some kind of professor, and he was saying, hey, basically that he didn't think it was particularly relevant to go back into the history to talk about the humanitarian situation today, which is basically kind of my position. I think if you know the history, good, but I don't think you need to go back that many years to say, well, there's these people, they don't have human rights, and that is all you need to know about the situation. If you want to find like a blame game of who is responsible and all of that, you can do that, but at the end of the day, we just have to resolve the situation today of these people's human rights. And that's one aspect that I think it's interesting, that even though Destiny seemed to have a similar position earlier on in the conflict, even though at that point he was already leaning Israel, he's been spending so much time researching it. And the other thing that I've noticed about Destiny's research is that even though he has been doing a lot of research and a lot of interesting research and looking at genuine, like credible sources, very verified sources, and he's been doing a lot of great debates. He's been doing debates pushing back against very far-right pro-Israel people and very reasonable debates with people who are on the Palestinian side, and also a lot of like shitty, terrible debates with just shouting at people who disagree with him on all of the issues. But like Destiny is not as much of it's easy to mistake him as being like fully on the unquestionably pro-Israel side, but his positions are a little bit more nuanced probably than we will see during this debate. It's just that if across from him on the table was a super far right ultra Zionist Israeli, he would be pushing back on against them as well. And if anyway, but the thing about that I find really weird about Destiny's research, as much as I think some of it is valuable, is that every once in a while he will come up against an extremely basic point of the by pro-Palestinian people, an extremely basic argument that anyone engaging with this topic has at least heard a few times, and he'll react as if it's the first time that he's heard of it. And that tells me that he seems to be in somewhat of an echo chamber, and he's tried to make efforts to get out of that echo chamber. But every once in a while, the other day he was hearing Hassan say that Palestinians didn't have to be perfect victims, and he was like, "Oh wow, that is such a weird argument. It's like a rape victim analogy or something like that." But it's like, no, it's not. It has nothing to do with rape victims. It's just a super basic talking point that everyone has been saying about Palestinians for years, and the fact that Destiny seems surprised by that argument kind of says something about the balance of the content that he's been engaging with on this topic. Anyway, back to this.
I'll try to limit myself to just a few points regarding Zionism and transfer. I think Chaim Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Organization, had it exactly right when he said that the objective of Zionism is to make Palestine as Jewish as England is English, or
LOL, there's nothing necessarily wrong with using Wikipedia as a primary source. Wikipedia is essentially today's encyclopedia. If you open an encyclopedia as a primary source, very few people, if you go back to Encyclopedia Britannica or something like that, no one would look at you weirdly. And I think there were studies on Wikipedia pages with more than 50 footnotes or something like that, that the error rate on Wikipedia pages, unless it's like a Wikipedia page that has barely anything on it, the error rate on large Wikipedia pages that are well maintained is essentially the same as encyclopedias today. So academically, it is frowned upon to use Wikipedia as a source, and you shouldn't quote Wikipedia and saying this came from Wikipedia. But using Wikipedia as a research thing is not nearly as ridiculous as academics would like to point out. It's just kind of a low-hanging fruit to insult people who are approaching this topic recently, rather than being old dude with white hairs who did their studies when Wikipedia wasn't around, essentially. Because I would guarantee you that anyone in university today will be also reading a lot of Wikipedia, and they would also go into other sources, but it's not like Wikipedia would be dismissed as not even a source of information, the way Finkelstein will do later on in this debate.
France is French. In other words, as Norman explained, a Jewish state requires Jewish political, demographic, and territorial supremacy. Without those three elements, the state would be Jewish in name only. And I think what distinguishes Zionism is its insistence, supremacy, and exclusivity. That would be my first point. The second point is, I think what the Soviet foreign minister at the time, Andrei Gromyko, said is exactly right, with one reservation. Gromyko was describing a European savagery unleashed against Europe's Jews. At the time, it wasn't Palestinians or Arabs. The savages and the barbarians were European to the core. It had nothing to do with developments in Palestine or the Middle East. Secondly, at the time that Gromyko was speaking, those Jewish survivors of the Holocaust and others who were in need of safe haven were still overwhelmingly on the European continent and not in Palestine. And I think, given the scale of the savagery, I don't think that any one state or country should have borne the responsibility for addressing this crisis. I think it should have been an international responsibility. The Soviet Union could have contributed. Germany certainly could and should have contributed. The United Kingdom and the United States, which slammed their doors shut to
I'm playing this at 1.5 times the speed, and he seems to be speaking at normal speed. It's kind of crazy. I think I'm going to play it even faster, but once we get to Destiny, I'll have to slow it down because he's known for speaking really, really fast. But these three people are incredibly slow speakers.
Persecuted Jews of Europe as the Nazis were rising to power. They certainly should have played a role. But instead, what passed for the international community at the time decided to partition Palestine. And here I think we need to judge the partition resolution against the realities that obtained at the time. Two-thirds of the population of Palestine was Arab. The Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, constituted about 1/3 of the total population and controlled even less of the land within Palestine. As a preeminent Palestinian historian, Walid al-Khalidi has pointed out, the partition resolution, in giving roughly 55% of Palestine to the Jewish community, and I think 42% to the Arab community, to the Palestinians, did not preserve the position of each community or even favor one community at the expense of the others. Rather, it thoroughly inverted and revolutionized the relationship between the two communities. And as many have written, the Nakba was the inevitable consequence of partition, given the nature of Zionism, given the territorial disposition, given the weakness of the Palestinian community, whose leadership had been largely decimated during a major revolt at the end of the 1930s, given that the Arab states were still very much under French and British influence. The Nakba was the inevitable product of the partition resolution. And one last point also about the UN's partition resolution is, yes, formally that is what the international community decided on the 29th of November 1947. It's not a resolution that could ever have gotten through the UN General Assembly today for a very simple reason. It was a very different General Assembly. Most African, most Asian states were not yet independent. Were the resolution to be placed before the international community today, and I find it telling that the minority opinion was led by India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, I think they would have represented the clear majority. So partition, given what we know about Zionism, given that it was entirely predictable what would happen, given the realities on the ground in Palestine, was deeply unjust. And the idea that either the Palestinians or the Arab states could have accepted such a resolution is I think, an illusion. That was in 1947. We saw what happened in 48 and 49. Palestinian society was essentially destroyed. Over 80%, I believe, of Palestinians resident in the territory that became the State of Israel were either expelled or fled, and ultimately were ethnically cleansed, because ethnic cleansing consists of two components. It's not just forcing people into refuge or expelling them. It's just as importantly preventing their return. And here, and Benny Morris has written, I think, an article about Yosefites and the transfer committees. There was a very detailed initiative to prevent the return, and it consisted of razing hundreds of Palestinian villages to the ground, which was systematically implemented, and so on. And so Palestinians became a stateless people. Now, what is the most important reason that no Arab state was established in Palestine? Well, since the 1930s, the Zionist leadership and the Hashemite leadership of Jordan, as has been thoroughly researched and written about by the Israeli-British historian Avi Shlaim, essentially colluded to prevent the establishment of an independent Arab state in Palestine in the late 1940s. There's much more here, but I think those are the key points I would make about 1948.
We may talk about Zionism, Britain, UN assemblies, and all the things you mentioned. There's a lot to dig into. So again, if we can keep it to just one statement moving forward,
sure.
After Stephen, if you want to go a little longer. Also, we should acknowledge the fact that the speaking speeds of people here are different. Stephen speaks about 10 times faster than me. Stephen, do you want to comment on 1948?
Yeah, I think it's interesting where people choose to start the history. I notice a lot of people like to start at either 47 or 48 because it's the first time where they can clearly point to a catastrophe that occurs on the Arab side that they want to ascribe 100% of the blame to the newly emergent Israeli state to. But I feel like when you have this type of reading of history, it feels like the goal is to moralize everything first and then to pick and choose facts that kind of support the statements of your initial moral statement afterwards. Whenever people are talking about 48 or the establishment of the Arab state, I never hear about the fact that a civil war started in 47. That was largely instigated because of the Arab rejectionism of the 47 partition plan. I never hear about the fact that the majority of the land that was acquired happened by purchases from Jewish organizations of Palestinian Arabs of the Ottoman Empire before the mandatory period in 1920 even started. Funnily enough, King Abdullah of Jordan was quoted as saying, "The Arabs are as prodigal in selling their land as they are in weeping about it." I never hear about the multiple times that Arabs rejected partition, rejected living with Jews, rejected any sort of state that would have even had any sort of Jewish exclusivity. It's funny because it was brought up before that the partition plan was unfair, and that's why the Arabs rejected it, as though they rejected it because it was unfair, because of the amount of land that Jews were given, and not just due to the fact that Jews were given land at all, as though a 30% partition or a 25% partition would have been accepted, when I don't think that was the reality of the circumstances. I feel like most of the other stuff has been said, but I noticed that whenever people talk about 48 or the years preceding 48, I think the worst thing that happens is there's a cherry picking of the facts where basically all of the blame is ascribed to this built-in idea of Zionism that because of a handful of quotes or because of an ideology, we can say that transfer or population expulsion or basically the mandate of all of these Arabs being kicked off the land was always going to happen, when I think there's a refusal sometimes as well to acknowledge that regardless of the ideas of some of the Zionist leaders, there is a political, social, and military reality on the ground that they're forced to contend with. And unfortunately, the Arabs because of their inability to engage in diplomacy and only to use tools of war to try to negotiate everything going on in mandatory Palestine, basically always gave the Jews a reason or an excuse to fight and acquire land through that way because of their refusal to negotiate on anything else, whether it was the partition plan in 47, whether it was the Lausanne Peace Conference afterwards, where Israel even offered to annex Gaza in 51, where they offered to take in 100,000 refugees. Every single deal is just rejected out of hand because the Arabs don't want a Jewish state anywhere in this region of the world.
Wait, did you say like, oh, Israel offered to annex Gaza and they refused? Oh yeah, why? Obviously, yeah, and especially in a situation where at the time Arab states and the Palestinians thought they were going to win the war. Yeah, it's unsurprising that they would be unwilling to compromise, and even to this day, when they know that they're in a losing position, they're in a lot of cases refusing to compromise because they think that they have the just moral position. But obviously that is kind of unworkable because the just moral position in the grand scheme of history doesn't particularly help your cause in a lot of cases.
I would like to engage Professor Morris. If you don't mind, I'm not with the first name. It's just not my way of relating.
You can just call me Morris. You don't need the professor.
Okay. There's a real problem here. And it's been a problem I've had over many years of reading your work. Apart perhaps from as grandchild, I suspect nobody knows your work better than I do. I've read it many times, not once, not twice, at least 3 times, everything you've written. And the problem is, it's a kind of quicksilver. It's very hard to grasp a point and hold you to it. So we're going to try here to see whether we can hold you to a point. And then you argue with me the point. I have no problem with that. Your name, please?
Stephen Bonnell.
Okay. Mr. Bonnell referred to cherry.
This is kind of weird, and the whole... I don't know why a lot of debaters do this, pretending to not know each other. Like, there was a similar thing between... I don't remember, but this thing of, like, interacting regularly with someone, and then once you're actually in front of cameras going like, oh, what's your name again? I don't know who you are. Maybe he only interacted with him knowing him as Destiny, and that's why he was asking for his actual name. But for the entire rest of the debate, he's going to butcher his name almost every single time he says it.
Picking and handful of quotes. Now, it's true that when you wrote your first book on the Palestinian refugee question, you only had a few lines on this issue of transfer.
4 pages.
Yeah. In the first book.
In the first book, 4 pages.
Maybe 4. I'm not going to quarrel. My memory is not clear. We're talking about 40 years ago. I read it, but then I read other things about you. Okay. And you were taken to task, if my memory is correct, that you hadn't adequately documented the claims of transfer. Allow me to finish. And I thought that was a reasonable challenge because it was an unusual claim for a mainstream Israeli historian to say, as you did in that first book, that from the very beginning, transfer figured prominently in Zionist thinking. That was an unusual. If you read Anita Shapiro, you read Shabtai Tevitt, that was an unusual acknowledgement by you. And then I found it very impressive that in that revised version of your first book, you devoted 25 pages to copiously documenting the salience of transfer in Zionist thinking. And in fact, you used a very provocative and resonant phrase. You said that transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. We're not talking about circumstantial factors, a war, Arab hostility. You said it's inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism. Now, as I said, so we won't be accused of cherry picking, those were 25 very densely argued pages. And then in an interview, and I could cite several quotes, but I'll choose one, you said, removing a population was needed. Let's look at the words. Without a population expulsion, a Jewish state would not have been established. Now, you're the one, again, I was very surprised when I read your book. Here I'm referring to Righteous Victims. I was very surprised when I came to that page 37, where you wrote that territorial displacement and dispossession was the chief motor of Arab resistance to Zionism. Territorial displacement and dispossession were the chief motor of Arab resistance to Zionism. So you then went on to say, because the Arab population rationally feared territorial displacement and dispossession, it of course opposed Zionism. That's as normal as Native Americans opposing the Euro-American manifest destiny in the history of our own country, because they understood it would be at their expense. It was inbuilt and inevitable. And so now, for you to come along and say that it all happened just because of the war, that otherwise the Zionists made all these plans for a happy minority to live there, that simply does not gel. It does not cohere. It is not reconcilable with what you yourself have written. It was inevitable and inbuilt. Now, in other situations you've said, that's true, but I think it was a greater good to establish a Jewish state at the expense of the indigenous population. That's another kind of argument. That was Theodore Roosevelt's argument in our own country. He said, we don't want the whole of North America to remain a squalid refuge for these wigwams and teepees. We have to get rid of them and make this a great country. But he didn't deny that it was inbuilt and inevitable.
I think you've made your point. First, I'll take up something that Mouin said. He said that the Nakba was inevitable.
As have you.
And predictable. No, I've never said that. It was inevitable and predictable only because the Arabs assaulted the Jewish community and state in 1947-48. Had there been no assault, there probably wouldn't have been a refugee problem. There's no reason for a refugee problem to have occurred, expulsions to have occurred, a dispossession, massive dispossession to occur. These occurred as a result of war. Now, Norman has said that I said that transfer was inbuilt into Zionism in one way or another. And this is certainly true. In order to buy land, they had the Jews bought tracts of land on which some Arabs sometimes lived. Sometimes they bought tracts of land on which there weren't Arab villages, but sometimes they bought land on which there were Arabs. And according to Ottoman law and the British, at least in the initial years of the British mandate, the law said that the people who bought the land could do what they liked with the people who didn't own the land, who were basically squatting on the land, which is the Arab tenant farmers, which is, we're talking about a very small number actually of Arabs who were displaced as a result of land purchases in the Ottoman period or the mandate period. But there was dispossession in one way. They didn't possess the land, they didn't own it, but they were removed from the land. And this did happen in Zionism. And there's, if you like, an inevitability in Zionist ideology of buying tracts of land and starting to work it yourself and settle it with your own people and so on. That made sense. But what we're really talking about is what happened in 47-48. And in 47-48, the Arabs started a war. And actually, people pay for their mistakes. And the Palestinians have never actually agreed to pay for their mistakes. They make mistakes, they attack, they suffer as a result. And we see something similar going on today in the Gaza Strip. They do something terrible. They kill 1,200 Jews. They abduct 250 women and children and babies and old people and whatever. And then they start screaming, please save us from what we did, because the Jews are counterattacking. And this is what happened then. And this is what's happening now.
Whoa. Really? Is that what he's going for? Because the big difference is what's the death toll now in what's the death toll now in Gaza? It's like 35,000 or something like that. It's like this identification of all Palestinians with Hamas. It's like Hamas conducts an attack on October 7th, and then the Palestinians are like, "Hey, help us." Well, yeah, because most Palestinian civilians, most Palestinians did not attack on October 7th. So of course they would be like, "Hey, why are tens of thousands of us being killed here?" That's I get what he's trying to say, but even if you take it in a very charitable way, that's still a pretty disgusting argument to make.
There's something fairly similar in the situation here. Expulsion, and this is important, Norman, you should pay attention to this.
Like, he's basically arguing that that the Palestinians deserve this punishment from October 7th, which, yeah, that's pretty fucked up.
Is that expulsion, transfer were never policy of the Zionist movement before 47. It doesn't exist in Zionist platforms of the various political parties, of the Zionist organization, of the Israeli state, of the Jewish agency. Nobody would have actually made it into policy because it was always a large minority. If there were people who wanted it, always a large minority of Jewish politicians and leaders would have said, no, this is immoral. We cannot start a state on the basis of an expulsion. So it was never adopted, and actually was never adopted as policy even in 48, even though Ben-Gurion wanted as few Arabs in the course of the war staying in the Jewish state after they attacked it. He didn't want disloyal citizens staying there because they wouldn't have been loyal citizens. But this made sense in the war itself. But the movement itself and its political parties never accepted it. It's true that in 1937, when the British, as part of the proposal by the Peel Commission to divide the country into two states, one Arab, one Jewish, which the Arabs, of course, rejected, Peel also recommended that the Arabs, most of the Arabs in the Jewish state should be transferred, because otherwise, if they stayed and were disloyal to the emergent Jewish state, this would cause endless disturbances, warfare, killing, and so on. So Ben-Gurion and Weizmann latched onto this proposal by the most famous democracy in the world, the British democracy, when they proposed the idea of transfer side by side with the idea of partition, because it made sense. And they said, well, if the British say so, we should also advocate it, but they never actually tried to pass it as Zionist policy, and they fairly quickly stopped even talking about transfer after 1938.
So just to clarify, what you're saying is that 47 was an offensive war, not a defensive war.
By the Arabs, yes.
By the Arabs.
Yeah.
And you're also saying that there was never a top-down policy of expulsion.
Yes.
Just to clarify the point.
If I understood you correctly, you're making the claim that transfer, expulsion, and so on was in fact a very localized phenomenon, resulting from individual land purchases, and that if I understand you correctly, you're also making the claim that the idea that a Jewish state requires a removal or overwhelming reduction of the non-Jewish population was.
If the Arabs are attacking you, yes.
Yeah, basically try and me offensively defending my house. I mean, look, there is a little bit more more complication to the history here, because it's true that early I guess Zionists, you could say, or early settlers, or early people, early Jews who were even before World War II going to what was then Palestine, what is now Israel, or I guess what was then part of the Ottoman Empire, and like it had a bunch of names throughout history. Were some of them were like legitimately purchasing land, and some Palestinians were voluntarily selling their land to them. Once it became like a mass settler movement and an actual colonization movement, it's unsurprising that a lot of Palestinians would be like, hey, we will defend, like we're not interested in this becoming a different state. We are going to defend our land. So there's some complication to that a little bit, just because of some of the land purchases and all of that. It's also true that part of these 700,000 people who were pushed out during the Nakba did get, like, it's not all of it was actually Israeli fighters forcing people to leave. A large part of it was also Arab states who thought they were going to win, telling Arabs in the area, hey, leave during the fighting so that you're safe, and once we've won and we've prevented the establishment of this Israeli state, then you can come back and you can get back to your homes. And of course, they lost, so that didn't happen. A large part of those people who left did leave because they were instructed so by neighboring Arab countries, but there was also very much a documented top-down policy of pushing people out. There's like localized areas where there was a very violent, like organized efforts to push people out. But famously, there was an interaction that's been pretty well reported. I think the New York Times wrote about this a lot, and was like controversially got some pushback from Zionists on this. But essentially, Ben-Gurion, who was like the leader of the military, of one of the militaries, had an interaction with one of the people, basically asking him, what should we do with all the Palestinians or all the Arabs that still live here? And he just waved his hand, like he basically wouldn't answer the question, and then he went outside for a cigarette, reportedly, and then they had the conversation again, and instead of saying something out loud, he just waved his hand as a way of saying, push them out. And that is something that seems to be fairly seems to happen quite a bit, this kind of like plausible deniability of, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm going to make it so that you understand very clearly what to do, seems to be something that happens pretty often in throughout Israeli history, of, you know, not wanting traces of these decisions. But like, this conversation was actually documented.
Let's say prior to 1947, it would be your claim that the idea that a significant reduction or wholesale removal of the Arab population was not part of Zionist thinking. Well, I think there's two problems with that. I think what you're saying about localized disputes is,
you know, definitely, like, there was definitely a warning by Arab states telling people to leave. And there was a lot of people fleeing violence, like genuinely violence. Parsing out and saying, like, what percentage of each of those is, which, like, how many left due to which, it's probably a combination of those factors. So obviously the people who want to argue that Israel has nothing to do with the Nakba are going to say, oh, it's all because of Arab countries telling people to leave, and the pro-Palestinian side is going to say, no, that has nothing to do with it. It's all because of Israel. The reality, it's probably a combination of the two, and it's probably basically impossible to tell. But at the same time, there was a very real policy of pushing people out forcefully. So it doesn't really matter how many of them left, because we still know that at the very least, out of the 700,000 people who did leave, hundreds of thousands, whether you want to say it was 25% or 75% or wherever you land in there, it's still going to be hundreds of thousands of people who were forcefully, violently made to leave their homes.
Is correct. But I also think that there is a whole literature that demonstrates that transfer was envisioned by Zionist leaders on a much broader scale than simply individual land purchases. In other words, it went way beyond, we need to remove these tenants so that we can farm this land. The idea was, we can't have a state where all these Arabs remain, and we have to get rid of them. And the second, I think, impediment to that view is that long before the UN General Assembly convened to address the question of Palestine, Palestinian and Arab and other leaders as well had been warning ad infinitum that the purpose of the Zionist movement is not just to establish a Jewish state, but to establish an exclusivist Jewish state, and that transfer, forced displacement, was fundamental to that project. And just responding to, sorry, was it Bunnell or Donnell?
Yeah.
With a B?
Yeah.
You made the point that the problem here is that people don't recognize is that the first and last result for the Arabs is always war. I think there's a problem with that. I think you might do well to recall the 1936 general strike conducted by Palestinians at the beginning of the revolt, which at the time was the longest recorded general strike in history. You may want to consult the book published last year by Laurie Allen, A History of False Hope, which discusses in great detail the consistent engagement by Palestinians, their leaders, their elites, their diplomats, and so on, with all these international committees. If we look at today, the Palestinians are once again going to the International Court of Justice. They're consistently trying to persuade the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to do his job. They have launched widespread boycott campaigns. So, of course, the Palestinians have engaged in military resistance. But I think the suggestion that this has always been their first and last resort and that they have somehow spurned civic action, spurned diplomacy, I think really has no basis in reality.
I'll respond to that, and then a question for Norm to take into account, I think, when he answers Benny. But I am curious. Obviously, I have fresher eyes on this, and I'm a newcomer to this arena versus the three of you guys for sure. A claim that gets brought up a lot has to do with the inevitability of transfer in Zionism, or the idea that as soon as the Jews envisioned a state in Palestine, they knew that it would involve some.
To keep the speaking speed at rough parity, I have to switch it from 125 to 175 when it's Destiny or any of the others.
Mass transfer of population, perhaps a mass expulsion. I'm sure we'll talk about Plan Dalet or Plan D at some point. The issue that I run into is, while you can find quotes from leaders, while you can find maybe desires expressed in diaries, I feel like it's hard to truly ever know if there would have been mass transfer in the face of Arab peace, because I feel like every time there was a huge deal on the table that would have had a sizable Jewish and Arab population living together, the Arabs would reject it out of hand. So, for instance, when we say that transfer was inevitable, when we say that Zionists would have never accepted, a sizable Arab population, how do you explain the acceptance of the 47 partition plan that would have had a huge Arab population living in the Jewish state? Is your contention that after the acceptance of that, after the establishment of that state, that Jews would have slowly started to expel all of these Arab citizens from their country? Or how do you explain that in Lausanne a couple years later that Israel was willing to formally annex the Gaza Strip and make 200,000 or so people those citizens? But I'm just curious, how do we get this idea of Zionism always means mass transfer when there were times, at least early on in the history of Israel and a little bit before it, where Israel would have accepted a state that would have had a massive Arab population in it? Is your idea that they would have just slowly expelled them afterwards? Or
is that question to me or Norm?
Or to either one? I'm just curious for the incorporation of the answer. Yeah.
There's some misunderstandings here, so let's try to clarify them. Number one, it was the old historians who would point to the fact, in Professor Morris's terminology, the old historians, what he called not real historians, he called them chroniclers, not real historians. It was the old Israeli historians who denied the centrality of transfer in Zionist thinking. It was then Professor Morris who, contrary to Israel's historian establishment, who said, now you remind me it's 4 pages, but it came at the end of the book. It was
No, it's at the beginning of the book.
transfer.
Yeah, transfer is dealt with in 4 pages at the beginning of my first book on the Palestinian refugee problem.
It's a fault of my memory, but the point still stands. It was Professor Morris who introduced this idea in what you might call a big way.
Yeah, but I didn't say it's central to the Zionist experiment or experience. You're saying centrality.
Okay.
I never said it was central. I said it was there, the idea.
By the way, it's okay to respond back and forth. This is great. And also just a quick question, if I may. You're using quotes from Benny, from Professor Morris. It's also okay to say those quotes do not reflect the full context of the. So, like, if we go back, to quotes we've said in the past, and you've both here have written, the three of you have written on this topic a lot, is we should be careful. And
yeah, it is funny to see the. I know the dynamic of the debate is going to get very, very different later on in the conversation, but it is interesting to see like the way all three of them engage with the debate so far, and then Destiny comes in very much as a from a completely different angle, because he isn't an academic and he's just approaching this mostly as a decently informed layman, but not doesn't seem to have any of the rigor that that the others have so far in the dynamic. I know that when they're going to start to go back and forth and they're going to get into less prepared statements, the dynamic is going to change completely, and we'll see what happens then. But so far, it does very much feel like if I didn't know anything about any of the people here and I was just watching this out of context, I would very much be wondering what the hell Destiny is doing at the table. But he's barely spoken so far, so let's see what happens.
Just admit, like, well, yeah, well, that's
Just real quick, just to be clear, the contention is that Norm is quoting a part and saying that this was the entire reason for this,
Okay.
whereas Benny's saying it's a part of the.
I'm not quoting a part. I'm quoting 25 pages where Professor Morris was at great pains to document the claim that appeared in those early 4 pages of his book. Now, you say it never became part of the official Zionist platform.
It never became part
Okay,
of policy.
Fine.
Yeah, I know
Fine,
what you're
fine,
saying,
fine,
but
yeah,
it
okay.
wasn't policy.
We're also asked, well, if this is true, why did that happen? Why did that happen? It's because it's a very simple fact, which everybody understands. Ideology doesn't operate in a vacuum. There are real world practical problems. You can't just take an ideology and superimpose it on the political reality and turn it into a fact. It was the British Mandate. There was significant Arab resistance to Zionism. And that resistance was based on the fact, as you said, the fear of territorial displacement and dispossession. So you couldn't very well expect the Zionist movement to come out in neon lights and announce, hey, we're going to be expelling you the first chance we get.
Can
That's not realistic.
Okay,
Now,
let me
okay.
respond. Look, you've said it a number of times that the Arabs, from fairly early on in the conflict, from the 1890s or the early 1900s, said the Jews intend to expel us. This doesn't mean that it's true. It means that some Arabs said this, maybe believing it was true, maybe using it as a political instrument to gain support to mobilize Arabs against the Zionist experiment. But
And
the
it
fact
turned
is,
out to be true.
Transfer did not occur before 1947. And Arabs later said, and since then, have said that the Jews want to build a third temple on the Temple Mount, as if that's what really the mainstream of Zionism has always wanted and always strived for. But this is nonsense. It's something that Husseini used to use as a way to mobilize masses for the cause, using religion as the way to get them to join him. The fact that Arabs said that the Zionists wanted to dispossess us doesn't mean it's true. It just means that some Arabs thought that, maybe said it sincerely and maybe insincerely.
I guess the steel man of this thing is that sometimes it happens. It's kind of like, when an event happens. Let's say a terrorist attack happens, what example can I give from recently? Oh, a good example would be the origins of the COVID-19 thing, where a bunch of people were speculating about lab leak before there was any evidence of that, and it turned out that it turned out that it was more likely than we initially thought. Maybe this is not the best example, but anyway, sometimes people will speculate and come up with answers to events that are completely unfounded, but that turn out to be true later. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were right in their initial that their logic was correct in the initial speculation, or that they had the right reasons to come to those conclusions, even if they just happened to be correct, were proven correct by history later on. That is me really steel manning this, but essentially he's saying, Palestinians were worried about being pushed out, and then they were pushed out, but that doesn't mean that they were right about being worried about that. Well, no, it does. Like, if they were worried about it and then it happened, then they were correct to be worried about it.
Sincerely.
Professor Morris.
Later, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is true.
Professor
Because
Morris.
the Arabs attacked the Jews.
Professor Morris, I read through your stuff. Even yesterday, I was looking through Righteous Victims.
You should read other things. You're wasting your time.
No, actually, no. I do read other things, but I don't consider it a waste of time to read you. Not at all. You say that this wasn't inherent in Zionism. Now, would you agree that David Ben-Gurion was a Zionist?
A major Zionist leader.
Right. Would you agree Chaim Weizmann was a Zionist?
Yeah.
Okay. I believe they were. I believe they took their ideology seriously. It was the first generation. just like with the Bolsheviks, the first generation was committed to an idea. By the 1930s, it was just pure realpolitik. The ideology went out the window. The first generation, I have no doubt about their convictions. Okay? They were Zionists. Transfer was inevitable and inbuilt in Zionism.
You keep repeating the same
but
thing.
because I have, as I said, Benny, Mr. Morris, I have a problem reconciling what you're saying. It either was incidental or it was deeply entrenched. Here I read, it's deeply entrenched. Two very resonant words, inevitable and inbuilt.
Deeply entrenched, I never wrote.
Well,
That's-
I'm not
so
sure.
It's something you
I
just
don't-
invented.
okay.
But
In
it was
inevitable
there.
and
No, no,
inbuilt.
the idea.
Okay.
Let me concede.
Fine,
let me concede
fine.
something.
No.
The idea of transfer was there. Israel Zangwill, a British Zionist, talked about it early on in the century.
Maybe he's going to clarify, but like he's saying, the idea of transfer was there, and the Palestinians were worried about being transferred, and they happened to be transferred later. But that doesn't mean that they were right to be. I don't understand his logic here. It's. I was doing a Steelman earlier, but I really don't think the Steelman works in this case because he's arguing against himself here.
Even Herzl, in some way, talked about transferring population.
According to your 25 pages, everybody talked
Well,
about
that's we keep bringing up this line from the 25 pages and the 4 pages. We're lucky to have Benny in front of us right now. We don't need to go to the quotes. We can legitimately ask how central is expulsion to Zionism in its early version of Zionism, in whatever Zionism is today, and how much power, influence does Zionism and ideology have in Israel, and influence the philosophy, the ideology of Zionism have on Israel today.
The Zionist movement up to 1948, Zionist ideology was central to the whole Zionist experience, the whole enterprise up to 1948. And I think Zionist ideology was also important in the first decades of Israel's existence. Slowly, the hold of Zionism, if you like Bolshevism held the Soviet Union, gradually faded, and a lot of Israelis today think in terms of individual success and then the capitalism and all sorts of things which have nothing to do with Zionism. But Zionism was very important. But what I'm saying is that the idea of transfer wasn't the core of Zionism. The idea of Zionism was to save the Jews who had been vastly persecuted in Eastern Europe and, incidentally, in the Arab world, the Muslim world, for centuries, and eventually ending up with the Holocaust. The idea of Zionism was to save the Jewish people by establishing a state or re-establishing a Jewish state on the ancient Jewish homeland, which is something the Arabs today even deny, that there were Jews in Palestine or the land of Israel 2,000 years ago. Arafat famously said, what temple was there on Temple Mount? Maybe it was in Nablus, which of course is nonsense. But they had a strong connection for thousands of years to the land to which they wanted to return, and returned there. They found that on the land lived hundreds of thousands of Arabs, and the question was how to accommodate the vision of a Jewish state in Palestine alongside the existence of these Arab masses living on, who were indigenous, in fact, to the land by that stage. And the idea of partition, because they couldn't live together, because the Arabs didn't want to live together with the Jews, and I think the Jews also didn't want to live together in one state with Arabs in general. The idea of partition was the thing which the Zionists accepted. Okay, we can only get a small part of Palestine. The Arabs will get in 1937 most of Palestine. In 1947, the ratios were changed, but we can live side by side with each other in a partitioned Palestine. And this was the essence of it. The idea of transfer was there, but it was never adopted as policy. But in 1947-48, the Arabs attacked, trying to destroy essentially the Zionist enterprise and the emergent Jewish state. And the reaction was transfer in some way, not as policy, but this is what happened on the battlefield. And this is also what Ben-Gurion at some point began to want as well.
Right.
Well, one of the first books on this issue I read when I was still in high school, because my late father had it, was the Diaries of Theodor Herzl. And I think, Theodor Herzl, of course, was the founder of the contemporary Zionist movement. And I think if you read that, it's very clear. For Herzl, the model upon which the Zionist movement would proceed, his model was Cecil Rhodes. I think, Rhodes, from what I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, has quite a prominent place in Herzl's diaries. I think Herzl was also corresponding with him and seeking his support. Cecil Rhodes, of course, was the British colonialist after whom the former white minority regime in Rhodesia was named. And Herzl also says explicitly in his diaries that it is essential to remove the existing population from Palestine.
Can I respond to this?
In a moment, please. He says we shall have to spirit the penniless population across the borders and procure employment for them elsewhere or something. And Israel's Zangwill, who you mentioned, a land without a people for a people without a land. They knew damn well it wasn't a land without a people. I'll continue, but please go ahead.
Just to this. There is one small diary entry in Herzl's vast
It's 5
diary.
volumes.
Yeah, 5 volumes. There's one paragraph which actually mentions the idea of transfer. There are people who think that Herzl was actually pointing to South America when he was talking about that. The Jews were going to move to Argentina, and then they would try and buy out or buy off or spirit the penniless natives.
Yeah, I agree. The thing is, I know that there are arguments later on in the debate, like the clips that I've seen where I actually have a lot more to say about some of the arguments are coming, I'm guessing, in the second half of the debate, and it's a 5-hour debate. But I don't want to just look at those clips without the context of what came before, because it's entirely possible that those clips were clipped out of context. But yeah, like as the debate goes on, they're going to not have notes that address exactly the points, and they're going to start to improvise a lot more, and that's when they start to say a lot crazier things and start to throw ad hominems around, and Destiny makes some really, really insane arguments that I do want to address, but I don't want to address them outside of watching what comes from the other side and what could explain his reasoning there.
To make way for Jewish settlement.
But yeah, so far I wish I knew exactly what was said exactly where, so I could just skip ahead and skip some of the less relevant parts, because of a lot of this is just does kind of feel pointless and like bickering over the specific history in ways that doesn't feel particularly productive and doesn't feel like there's anything that is coming out of like anything productive coming out of it, anything to gain from watching this. But yeah, hopefully it gets more interesting soon. Maybe we could switch straight to the October 7th part. You know what? Maybe let's do that, because I was saying earlier that I'm not particularly interested in the history. I do agree that the history is a little bit more complicated than the current humanitarian situation. But I'm not particularly interested in debating who's right and who's wrong from 50 or 70 years ago. To me, that's kind of beside the point. So maybe let's just skip ahead to October 7th and when we get to present day situations, because I know that once we get to debates over whether or not this is a genocide or what constitutes a genocide, that's when it gets really, really spicy. Yeah, you know what? A few streams ago, Tryon, there was an Israeli in chat who was arguing that basically all Jews in the world are Zionist. So the term Zionist is kind of unhelpful because its base definition is just people who believe that there should be a Jewish state. When I use the term Zionist, I use it as a much more extreme version. It's the people who really feel entitled to essentially the entirety of the land, including the West Bank, including Gaza, and want to settle the entire thing. There's a lot of people in Israel who argue that it is their duty as Israelis to take more land in the West Bank and to build more settlements and to actually push Israeli-controlled land further and further. And that's what I consider to be those are the kinds of people that I refer to when I say, yeah, that is Zionism, and that's why Zionism is a problem. But there are people who have an understanding of Zionism that is way more moderate than that. To me, it's like Zionism is the feeling of entitlement to this land at the exclusion of the rights of the people who have been living there for generations. On the other side, the idea that basically every Jew in the world is Zionist, or like the majority of Jews in the world are Zionist. Majority maybe, but there are entire communities of Jews who, not just like individual Jews who like object to I guess Finkelstein is like, you know, a person who is Jewish and who objects to to what Israel is doing, but there are actually entire communities of Jews living outside of Israel who hate the existence of Israel as a state. If you've seen the series Unorthodox, it's on Netflix. It tells the story of a Jewish girl from a Jewish community in New York. So there are actually these Jewish communities in New York that are almost entirely insular and have very little interaction with the rest of the United States. Many of them don't even speak English. They only speak Yiddish and only interact with people inside of their community. And they're very, very proudly Jewish and have like a very strong like Jewish culture and respect for those cultures and events and all of that. And those communities, or some of those communities at least, the reason why they're not living in Israel is because they're opposed to the existence of Israel. They think that, like, there's a scene in the series, and the series is, as far as I understand, incredibly true to the nature of these communities. There are actually some actors who come from similar communities who are like, this is the reason why I'm playing in this series, is because this is my story as well, like actually my story. There's a scene where the girl who flees that community goes to a hotel and she's asked for ID, and before she was able to provide ID, the hotel staff asked if she's from Israel, and she was like, "No, I'm not from Israel. I'm not a Zionist." And yeah, that there are absolutely Jews who are like vitriolically against the existence of Israel. So the idea that all Jews, or like the vast majority of Jews, are kind of a monolith on this position is just untrue. In addition to the idea of like Zionism having different meanings to different people, makes it kind of unhelpful to talk about that. Yeah, I've heard that argument actually from Jews as well, of saying that there are some Jews like in those communities who are just in principle against the existence of a Jewish state. They think that goes against Judaism. But there are also people who argue that the actions of the Israeli government, like, there could have been a Jewish state that would have been fine, but the actions of the Israeli government, as they're doing today and as they have been doing for decades, is actually fueling anti-Semitism throughout the world, which is also almost inarguable, because every single time there's a big conflict like this, there's a bunch of anti-Semitic attacks all over the world. That doesn't mean that it's okay to do those attacks. That doesn't justify those attacks. But it is undeniably true that the fact that Israel, and the fact that in this case Netanyahu, but he's not the only one to do this, but the fact that Netanyahu is claiming to speak on behalf of all Jews and is claiming as the leader of Israel to represent all Jews, while being a terrible, terrible human being who's just like getting even his fiercest allies to distance himself from him, is just terrible optics for the safety of all Jews throughout the world, essentially.
Facts.
Let's move to the modern day, and we'll return to history, maybe 67 and other important moments. But let's look to today, in the recent months. October 7th. Let me ask sort of a pointed question. Was October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel genocidal? Was it an act of ethnic cleansing? Just so we lay out the moral calculus that we are engaged in. Maybe it was
The problem with October 7th is this: the Hamas fighters who invaded southern Israel were ordered to murder, rape, and do all the nasty things that they did, and they killed some 1,200 Israelis that day, and abducted, as we know, something like 250 mostly civilians, also some soldiers, took them back to Gaza, dungeons in Gaza. But they were motivated not just by the words of their current leader in the Gaza Strip, but by their ideology, which is embedded in their charter from 1988, if I remember correctly. And that charter is genocidal. It says that the Jews must be eradicated basically from the land of Israel, from Palestine. The Jews are described there as sons of apes and pigs. The Jews are a base people, killers of prophets, and they should not exist in Palestine. It doesn't say that they necessarily should be murdered all around the world, the Hamas charter, but certainly the Jews should be eliminated from Palestine. And this is the driving ideology behind the massacre of the Jews on October 7th, which brought down on the Gaza Strip. And I think with the intention by the Hamas of the Israeli counteroffensive, because they knew that that counteroffensive would result in many Palestinian dead, because the Hamas fight.
Wait, look, he's switching to a different topic here, so I just wanted to address the charter. What he's saying about the charter is essentially true. Pro-Palestinian people do not like to talk about this, and they will dishonestly either pretend that this charter does not exist, and they'll be like, oh, let's Google the charter, and they'll open a more recent charter that doesn't have those parts anymore, and pretend like they don't know what anyone is talking about when they talk about the anti-Semitism in the founding charter of Hamas. But the founding charter of Hamas was like horrible when it comes to anti-Semitism, and the slightly more honest defenders of yeah, I know my camera is fucked up. I need to see if I can fix it, or I need to see if I can fix it in the future. Maybe use my new camera, but I think it's the cable that's being a problem, and I can't really do anything about that even with the new camera. Anyway, the Hamas charter. Defenders of, more honest defenders of Hamas will say that, oh, but that was the old charter and they don't say that anymore and they're so much more moderate now. And what I would say is, like, yeah, the new charter is, I mean, objectively it's better because it doesn't have that, like, blatant, explicit anti-Semitism anymore, and it used way more moderate language and way more, humanistic kind of oh, but it's just about finding it's about human rights, and it's about our opposition to Israel as a state and not to the Jewish people or stuff like that. And like, that sounds a lot better, but it's kind of like when we were reading about far right parties moderating their language to appeal to less extreme people. Hamas knows that their old charter looked really, really bad, and we wouldn't assume that much good faith on the part of far right anti-Semitic groups if they were like, oh, no, but it's actually not about Jews, it's actually about Israel. We wouldn't be okay with that coming from a neo-Nazi group, and we wouldn't pretend like, oh no, they're actually not anti-Semites anymore. They're just opposed to Israel as a country. So why do we why would anyone accept Hamas's moderation on face value when they continue to do stuff like October 7th? It's kind of it kind of feels very bad faith to me to pretend that either the charter doesn't exist, or that it's that the fact that they rewrote the charter completely negates the old charter, because a lot of the people who were in Hamas at the time are still in Hamas today. And like, Hamas is not a monolith. I'm sure there are people who genuinely just want the freedom of their people and who aren't as anti-Semitic as the old charter suggests. My camera is really, really messing. Let me see if I can maybe prop up the cable in a better way. I don't think I can. Ugh. Yeah. Let me see. Like, this could be better. Nope, that is definitely not better. That is not reconnecting with the camera, so that is bad. Give me a second. Sorry about that. If it has to be a rave or nothing, it'll be a rave. But I'll see if I can fix it before next stream. This? No. just black. Okay, give me a second. Turning it off and back on. Nope. I shouldn't have touched it. I should not have touched my camera. This is not good. Maybe now? No. Still not. Yeah, seems like I messed up my camera. Should I just call it a day and start over next stream at the Gaza part with a fully functioning camera next time? I think I'm gonna do that, unless I can get it to... Yeah, no, it's not starting over. It's not working again. Yeah, I think I'm gonna do that, guys, because I'm still pretty tired, and I do want to... Well, I can't even put a full screen camera anymore. Yes, perfect. This is me. This is what I look like now. Let me put this. I have been really struggling to make progress. Like, the thing is, there's a lot of exciting things happening very slowly with the channel that are kind of taking up a lot of my focus. I'm also really stressed out with a lot of other... Colorfully informed. Hey. I'm also really stressed out about a lot of other just like general life things that I have to take care of at the same time, paperwork, bureaucracy, stuff like that. So it's a little it's been a frustrating few weeks because I wanted to have the next video out a month ago, and it's still taking my progress has been incredibly slow, and I'm not happy with myself with how little progress I've been making. Hopefully, in what's going to happen, because the thing is, I have a lot of things that are happening in parallel, and hopefully, when those things do start to happen, they're going to basically be happening like bam, 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 in quick succession, because of the work that I will have done in parallel before they happened. But it's definitely making me struggle with with the current project that I have right now, and I should have done some better a better job planning for it. But anyway, I'm gonna call it a day for today, and fix my camera so that next stream we can go over, have some really cool guests to talk about the situation in Russia, and go over this debate and go over some more stuff. And hopefully by next weekend, I will have made some real progress on the next video. It's definitely not going to be done by next weekend, but hopefully shortly after that is when we can actually have some real progress. So anyway, I appreciate you guys sticking around for now. Hopefully this camera problem is not anything broken. Maybe I have to replace the cable, but hopefully not, because that would be annoying. I definitely hope it's not the HDMI ports in my camera, because that would mean that essentially I would have to fix the camera itself, and I don't know how long that would take. But yeah, I'll take care of that by then. I'll definitely have a solution, whether it's using the other camera or just getting a new cable. And I will see you in a week, and it's going to be a really cool stream. Stream will be Sunday, 7 p.m. as usual. And yep, I think that's all. If you want to support the channel, if you're new here, I saw a few people subscribe during the stream today. If you're new here and you want to support the channel, Patreon is the way to go. But if you just want to give a specific one-time dono, let me have a quick look at if there have been any donos so far this stream, but I haven't seen any last time I checked. Doesn't seem to have been. Nope. And yeah, if you want to support the channel, donations individually or Patreon, and just supporting the channel by watching is also incredibly helpful. Share my videos, share the channel, and I will see you in a week. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.